this?
And how's this? We're okay? Can you guys hear us? All right, cool.
All right, we can't actually see you.
I know.
At all. But it seems like there are people out there, so thank you for coming, and thank you to Rachel for inviting us to do this. And of course, thank you to Deb for making the trek. Deb, how do we know each other?
So, Desi, let me tell you. So, Desi and I met on a 7-minute workout group on Zoom during COVID that my friend Ayel had started. Well, she started it, I got COVID on March 18th, 2020. So I was out for the first month of 7-minute workout.
It was a very punctual March 18th.
Yeah, March 18th, which is basically the beginning. So I got really, really sick. And after I got well, Ayel had said, you have to join my 7-minute workout group, which is just a bunch of women like in various cities around the United States doing 7-minute workout because we were all stuck in our homes and we were afraid that we were never going to work out again. And then Desi joined in October.
Yeah, so I've been doing it for a year.
Right, and so today is the first day that Desi and I have officially met, but I feel like we've been best friends for a year.
We've been sweating, watching each other sweat for at least a year. So
because the 7-minute workout is not really about the 7-minute workout. It's about the gossip before the 7-minute workout and the gossip after the 7 minutes.
It's 7 minutes of shooting the shit beforehand.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's just an excuse to get out of our chairs, but it's been a really amazing way of connecting with women that I mean, the funny thing is that with the exception of myself, I feel like everybody on that list are just really illustrious authors whose work I've read. And so like, oh, wow, that person, I'm working out with that person. I've read this person's book. So it's a pretty amazing collection of people.
And then I just went to Greece with 3 of the other girls, or girls, we're all old women, with 3 of the other women in the group. And
we're sort of leaping out from behind the screens finally and able to meet each other. But I will say that it must have been in March or April of 2021 that Deb had an advanced reader's copy over email, and she sent it to a bunch of us on the 7-Minute Women, and I was pleased to see that we're almost all in the acknowledgments.
Yep.
And read this book and was so moved by it, so excited by it, instantly told Rachel about it and just said, there's this incredible book that's really important, and I think men and women all should be reading this. And she said, well, why don't we invite her to come up? And so here we are.
And so here we are.
And so in preparation for this, I went back in time and I read your first memoir, which I think is maybe exactly 20 years old.
It's exactly 20 years old.
First book called Shutterbabe. Did you want to tell everybody a little bit about what Shutterbabe was?
So Shutterbabe was my first book, first memoir, and it was a memoir of the years that I was a war photographer between 1988 and 92, mostly based in Paris. And I covered Afghanistan during the Soviet pullout. I covered Romania during the coup. I covered the Soviet Union during the coup. Just like everything that happened between 1988 and 92 that was close enough to Paris to get to on time, I covered. And so, I mean, I can just sort of dive in here for a second. The structure of the book was each chapter was a different war, but I named it after the man that was just slightly off screen, or somebody I'd been dating, or my son, because I wanted to turn the male gaze on its head. I wanted to make the female gaze. And I thought, what a way to do that would be to have the chapters named after men. And then Ladyparts, 20 years later, I was trying to figure out a structure, and I was in the shower one day, and I looked down at my body, and I have so many scars, because this is about having a hysterectomy, and then having a tracheolectomy, and then having an appendectomy. Like, there's just like, ectomies after ectomies. And I have so many scars down there, and I thought, oh, there's my book. Like, each chapter is going to be a body part, and that chapter served as a metaphor for what else is going on. For example, uterus, when I had my hysterectomy, the chapter called Uterus is not only about getting the uterus out, it's also about my friendship with Nora Ephron, who was a mentor and very maternal mother figure to me, who died as I was getting my uterus out, which was the exact same time that my teenage daughter got her period. So,
like to the day.
To the day, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you about the how you sort of arrived at that superstructure, but you...
I just already answered it.
Yeah, I know, which was kind of incredible. I think, so I read Shutterbabe, and then I reread Ladyparts again in preparation for this, and it's so interesting to see these sorts of themes emerging and things that have happened to you. And, if I could, this will be an incomplete list, but when I think about, all right, so you, in your lifetime, you have been mugged twice at gunpoint, you have been
raped,
you have been kicked in the face by an assailant walking home from
the
school,
library, yep.
The library. You've been sexually assaulted in numerous time zones, and over the course of your life, it seems like of the many things that you have survived, the ongoing struggle has been trying to survive being a woman in the American healthcare system, especially in this sort of cruel environment where our employment is linked to healthcare. What are some of the things that you have experienced that would be totally avoidable? That when you look back at the experience that you have had and the struggles that you've had in terms of your body, like if you were in France, what are some of these things?
So when I was driving my son to college, I felt a lump in my breast, and I sort of ignored it, and I was like, oh, maybe it's nothing, but it was something. And the problem was I had just gotten separated. My ex-husband had decided to move across the country and start a business somewhere. And so I had been relying as a writer on his health insurance for many years, and suddenly I didn't have it anymore. And so I had to suddenly not be a writer and go get a corporate job so that I could have the health insurance. And it took a long time to get that corporate job. And so meanwhile, the breast lump is growing. I can feel it growing. And I don't have the means to get a mammogram. And so I ended up calling the breast center of Harlem and asking if I was eligible for charity mammogram. And it turns out because I didn't have health insurance, I was. And then I sort of show up at the breast center of Harlem and feel like, oh, I'm a privileged white woman taking a mammogram away from this community. And they're like, looked at me and they're like, no, you can have the mammogram. And they discovered stage 0 breast cancer. And then I had to wait until I got the corporate job to get treatment for that, because they could find the lump at the breast center of Harlem, but they couldn't treat it. And then when you get a corporate job, it takes a month to actually get your health insurance to kick in. You don't get it for the first month. So I wasted 3 months, waiting for health insurance.
And what about what happened at a certain point? That was the job when you were working for...
Oh, and yes.
And because then there's the intense irony.
Yes, the intense irony of I got a job at a health magazine, which is not really a health magazine. It was like it was a front for pharmaceutical advertising that was pretending to be a health magazine.
Didn't you have to write a lot of copy about how to help addicts poop?
Yeah, all sorts of ridiculous. Well, that was the Edelman job. Sorry, that was the other. But anyway, essentially, we were allowed to write stories, for example, on type 2 diabetes because there are pharmaceutical interventions for that. But they were not interested in type 1 diabetes because there's no pharmaceutical intervention, so we couldn't write any stories on type 1 diabetes. Anyway, it was a shitty health magazine. It wasn't really a health magazine. And 3 months into my job there, I get called into human resources and I get fired for my absences. And all of my absences, nine absences in 3 months, were to visit Sloan Kettering. And I showed human resources my calendar and I said, all of my absences are breast cancer related.
And
this
you
is
were
a
working
health
in
magazine.
the waiting room, right? Like you were doing your editing work.
Doing
while
my
you were there.
editing work in Sloan Kettering's excellent Wi-Fi equipped waiting rooms, but they don't care. They don't care. And so I was fired from a health magazine for being unhealthy.
Deb, I was wondering if, sounds of silence. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, if Rachel handed me a copy of Ladyparts, if you wouldn't mind reading the first chunk of your
Sure.
book, and maybe chunk was
So
too on the nose.
I'll give you a little preview of this, which is what I'm about to describe is called vaginal cuff dehiscence. I did not know that term either before this happened.
Do anyone have Planned Parenthood? We got a whole Planned Parenthood friends. Do we have any?
Anyone
heard
know?
of this?
But I didn't. I mean, I thought I was pretty
Okay.
well informed about all the things that can happen to the vagina, but I didn't know that this could happen to it. It was after I had a trachelectomy, which is a cervix removal, which should have been taken out when I got my hysterectomy, but also bad science, bad advice, blah, blah, blah. So now I'm having the second major surgery on an organ that should have just already been removed. And 3 weeks after my trachelectomy, I began to bleed out. So here's the beginning. I think I need my glasses. Hold on one second.
Okay, and I also just want to say that since this book has been published in August because of COVID times, because I was saying, like, I'd love you to read this section, but maybe this is the section that you're always having to read. And Deb said, no, I haven't had a chance to do any readings.
This is my first reading.
So this is
I'll make it fast. I'm crawling around on the bathroom floor, picking up pieces of myself. These pieces are not metaphor, they are actual pieces. Plum-sized, beet-colored, with the consistency and sheen of chicken liver. 3 of them have shot out of me like shells from a cannon. I am bleeding out, but my brain, starved of blood and in shock at the sight of so much of it, cannot process this information. Instead, I've become convinced that the ordnance sliding around on my bathroom floor are my internal organs, which I must rescue so someone can put them back inside me. I head to the kitchen to hunt for Tupperware. Not just any Tupperware, the glass kind. Heaven forbid my liver and kidney should come into contact with BPAs. It does not occur to me in my befuddled state that had my internal organs actually fallen from my body, I would not have the pulse with which to rummage in my kitchen cabinet in search of a container to store them. It is Saturday night, now Sunday morning, just after midnight of the July 4th weekend, 2017. Pads and underwear have become useless against these pyrotechnics, so it's just me and my bathrobe hemorrhaging. Outside, bootleg fireworks are erupting into the sky. Inside, gravity has forced another palm-sized chunk to plunge, splat, onto the kitchen floor. And the rocket's red glare indeed. Happy Independence Day to me. Added bonus, I'm mid-divorce. I scoop up the large mass and put it in the glass container with the others. With the blobs now safely stored in carcinogen-free glass on top of the shelf of my fridge, I've seen enough medical procedurals to know about the importance, when transporting human organs, of picnic coolers. I call the answering service for my surgeon, who 3 weeks earlier had removed my cervix. This post-op emergency, which I'm not yet prepared to call an emergency, is unusual. In fact, of all trachelectomies, that's the clinical name for cervix removal, performed in the US, only a small percentage result in, quote, vaginal cuff dehiscence. The clinical name for, the stitches where they sewed up the top of your vaginal canal have come undone, and now you're a blood clot howitzer. I am 12 hours without medical intervention from my own death, possibly less. At this point, however, I know none of this, neither the number of hours I have left nor the technical name for what's happening. I just know I'm exhausted and bleeding profusely, that I'm still deep in the weeds of recovering from major surgery, that I'd already gone to the emergency room near family court 6 days after surgery, after nearly passing out from pain while representing myself at a custody hearing. But the hospital had sent me home saying, everything looked fine. I am loath to cry wolf again, but my apartment looks like a crime scene. So I'm crying medium-sized dog, possibly rabbit. Alas, no one from the hospital's calling me back, so I'm crying into the void anyway. I call the answering service again. I text them a photo of one of the masses in the palm of my hand for size context. Nada. I feel like medicine's needy girlfriend ghosted by the hospital. It has now magically jumped from midnight to 1:30 in the morning, like a Truffaut film. Qu'est-ce que c'est dégueulasse? What is disgusting? I mean, for starters, the bathroom floor. Part of me can't help but wonder if all of these bloody missiles are, in fact, metaphor, the expulsion of decades of marital sludge. But while I am grateful for my escape from a toxic, lonely marriage, I've recently been as alone as I've ever been, as lonely as I've ever felt. My eldest had been living with his girlfriend in Bangkok, where he's teaching English. My youngest is away at summer camp. My middle one has been in the Middle East, so I've been walking the dog and doing the dishes and taking out the trash and lugging the laundry back and forth from the communal laundry room in the basement on my own. None of these tasks are on the list of acceptable activities on the hospital handout they give you when they kick you out the morning after the surgery and tell you to rest. But having been recently downsized, I can't afford the added cost of a home health aide or, frankly, food or shelter. Aside from the few freelance gigs I've been able to cobble together from bed, I now have zero income combined with an extra $2,314.20 a month in COBRA fees, which has always struck me as one of the more insulting cosmic ironies of losing a job in America. Bye, have a nice life. Here's 0 months of severance, plus an extra rent's worth of healthcare costs.
Thank you. Now, do you mind, I mean, we don't want to do too much of a spoiler.
Yeah.
It's the beginning of the book, and I'm sure people will read it, but do you want to at least tell us what happens after this?
So that is like the in medias res beginning of the book, and then it goes 6 years back in time to give you sort of the context of that bleed out. And the context was, first I had a hysterectomy where they told me to keep my cervix in because, like in passive tense, I met an English teacher here earlier, it is believed to cause that the cervix is plays a role in sexual pleasure. That was debunked 5 years later, but at the time, they were advising women to keep their cervixes in, and so, of course, 5 years later, that cervix became diseased, and it had to come out as well, and that led to this bleed out. What else was you? What else?
Well, I just wanted to talk about when your daughter found you, and the sort of discussion that you had to have about how to even get to the hospital.
Right. So my daughter, who had literally just walked in the door, she had done Birthright, which is if you're a Jewish kid, you can go to Israel for free. And since I had no money, I was like, well, if you're going to go on vacation, you're going to have to go for a free one. And she found this one. And I was like, just don't listen to the Zionism. Just go and enjoy yourself and let the rhetoric just pass right over your head. So she found me bleeding, and she said, Mom, those are not your internal organs. If they were in your internal organs, you'd be dead. We have to get you to the hospital. And I was like, all right, well, let's go take the subway. And she's like, we're not taking the subway to the hospital. I'm like, well, I'm not taking an ambulance because I have read stories of ambulances costing up to $8,000, and we don't have that right now. And nor did I have proper health insurance. So she got angry at me, and she said, well, at least let's take an Uber there. And then she got really angry at me when she saw that I'd called up UberPool. Because it was $10 cheaper, like whatever. Yeah, I took UberPool to the emergency room and collapsed when I walked in. Yeah.
Now, would you say, when you're looking back on some of these darker moments or scarier moments, not talking about your Shutterbabe years, but in the American healthcare system years, that the mental anguish and the stress about figuring out how to pay for things was actually more challenging because it was like a maze that you couldn't figure out how to emerge from, even more frightening than any of these things that happened to you? I'm sure the bleed out was pretty darn scary, but.
Right, well, I mean, when I think back on my war photography years, for example, they were thrilling. There's some scary moments in there, but it wasn't like constant fear. I mean, a lot of war is boring. Afghanistan was boring until it wasn't boring, and then you have like a day of stress, and then it's fine again. But being a female in a female body in the American healthcare system and a solo mother who has no health insurance is a constant stressor, which actually causes bad health. And also I had something called PVCs at the time, which are, I forget, post-ventricular blah blah blah. If there's a cardiologist in the office, but like in the audience, but I was stressed out to the point of heart disease every single day.
Now, what are some of the things, and I know that people will read this book and find out for themselves, but you were just discussing that, for instance, at the time, years ago, they were saying, oh, if you're having a hysterectomy, you can keep the cervix.
Right.
And that's been debunked.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you wish you had known when you were, at the beginning of this odyssey? What are the sorts of things that you, in this sort of one-woman laboratory or experiment over these last years, what are the things that you're going to tell Sasha, your daughter, like, actually, no. Like today in my kitchen, you were giving me some advice, but there's a lot of wisdom in here. I mean, everything that's coming to mind, like what you were telling us about Viagra, for women, or like what are some of the things that you can pass along?
For the young women in here, the teenage girls, I would say that if you start having very heavy periods, there's something wrong. It's not okay. And I had something called adenomyosis, probably for at least 16 years, if not longer. And I only discovered that because my GP took my hemoglobin, and normal female hemoglobin is around 12 or so. It has to be above 12 for you to be okay, and mine was a 7. And he checked it again, and it was a 7. And when I used a Diva cup instead of a tampon, you could tell how much blood a Diva cup is an ounce of blood, right? And one period over a course of a week is supposed to produce about 1 ounce of blood. That's the entire period. I was producing an ounce of blood every half hour. So we should have, first of all, OBGYNs talking to people and not just saying, how are your periods? And you say, heavy, and they say, okay, and then they move on. But like saying, how heavy? How much blood are you producing? And if you don't know, here's a Diva cup, let's measure it, right? I wish I'd had a gynecologist who was well-versed in menopausal medicine. I did a little digging for this book, and I think the crazy thing was like only 18% of medical students had any training in menopausal medicine whatsoever. And fast forward a little bit to this summer, my daughter, who saved my life that night, just entered medical school, and she wants to be an OBGYN. Getting a little misty. And I said to her, when she walked out the door to go to school for her first day, because I dropped her off, I said, there's a big void in menopausal medicine, and maybe that's one thing that you'd like to do. And she's like, oh, trust me, yeah, I would like to do that.
Well, one of the things that the book seems to hit over and over is the underfunding of certain studies, and that for men that there's like a wealth of information.
So I didn't discover this. A woman named Carolyn Criado Perez wrote an amazing book called like The Data Gap or something like that. I can't remember what it's called, but she's an amazing writer. And in her book, I discovered that Viagra was found to eliminate period cramps for up to 4 hours without any side effects whatsoever. So basically the holy fucking grail of period cramps exists. But the FDA, when the doctor or the researcher that found this asked for money to fund a larger study to get more data, the FDA turned him down twice. And the reasoning was, we do not see dysmenorrhea as a really important health issue. And what's really fascinating is, like a woman, a urologist, this urologist who's like this sort of activist urologist who's my friend on Twitter reached out to me and she's like, I just read your book. I'm going to be giving all my patients Viagra from now on.
I really like activist urologists.
Yeah.
Good job. And what about, you were talking to me earlier about estrogen.
Oh, estrogen.
This feels like this is your people.
Okay. Estrogen. So,
and also, how did you learn it? You can tell the story about like, why do you know so much about estrogen?
Okay, so the reason I know a lot about estrogen is I started to forget words. So there was really a moment where I had an artichoke in my hand and I was looking at the artichoke and I was like, what is that? I know what that is, but I can't come up with the word. And then I was driving my daughter home from college and I called my partner on the phone and I was like, oh, there are a lot of bugs that it got, it was hot. There are a lot of bugs on I couldn't think of the word windshield, so I was like, on the piece of glass between me and the world.
By the way, I feel like you're describing my life. I mean, in your bio on your website, you refer to 1 decade in your life or a period of time in your life as the era when nouns disappeared.
Yeah, the noun disappearing. That's the 40s, yeah.
Right. I think we're there.
So I just started doing a little digging because I always do a little digging and the internet makes that much easier these days. And I found an op-ed by a researcher in New York named Lisa Mosconi who was studying the effects of estrogen, loss of estrogen on Alzheimer's. So I went up to her office to talk to her and I interviewed her. And she said, look, 2 out of every 3 people who get Alzheimer's are women. Why is that? And longevity doesn't account for that at all. And so she had her grandmother and her grandmother's sisters all had Alzheimer's, but their brother did not. Why? And she started doing the studies, and she truly believes that the loss of estrogen leads to Alzheimer's, and that women, the minute we go through perimenopause, should be put on menopausal hormone treatment immediately. Now, MHT, menopausal hormone treatment, is the new nomenclature for HRT, which was hormone replacement therapy, because the word replacement wasn't working with doctors. They were like, we're not replacing it, we're just giving it to you because you need it, it's a treatment. That was the first hint that I should go on estrogen. Then I found Dr. Molly McBride in New York, and she was very difficult to find because there are not a lot of doctors who focus on menopausal medicine. It took me days to find one, and I'm a good researcher. And then this activist urologist reached out to me over Twitter after she read the story that I wrote about estrogen and Alzheimer's in the Atlantic. And she said, and I'd written about recurring UTIs, urinary tract infections. And she said, you can end your recurring UTIs with estrogen. I was like, what? Like, why is somebody reaching out to me over Twitter to tell me something that like a doctor should tell me?
And my gynecologist
like, why is this happening? So anyway, in conjunction with the activist urologist and my newfound friend, Dr. Molly McBride in New York, I was put on estrogen and my life has changed. So I no longer get recurrent UTIs, and I was getting dozens of them, to the point where I was put on a prophylactic dose of nitrofurantoin, which is a antibiotic, which, as Dr. Rachel Rubin, the activist urologist, pointed out to me, is you would have much higher incidence of breast cancer from that than from the hormone replacement. And by the way, the Women's Health Initiative, which is what scared all of us off of hormones, had a lot of faulty data, and also the data they had was from a pill, an oral pill, Premarin. When the hormones you get these days are gels and patches, and there's something called estrone, which is just vaginal estrogen, which even if you had the kind of breast cancer that is estrogen related, you can still take vaginal estrogen. And as both the urologist and my OBGYN have pointed out to me, sex is important for health. Sex is important for health. We need to start talking about it for women because it keeps us healthy. And when you are lacking estrogen, sex can become painful. And so the urologist was saying to me, look, we're giving men Viagra and we're not giving women anything. What do you think happens? So many divorces. So anyway, I would highly recommend to all the women in here who are post 45 to talk to your doctors about menopausal hormone treatment.
To that end, one of the things that I was struck by in the book, and that it was reminding me when you were talking about this, about women having either long or really heavy painful periods, is that you were noticing that there's a trend not only in yourself, but that statistically women tend to underreport,
right,
and underreport their pain, minimize. When people are like, on a scale of 1 to 10, and like, how's your labor going? Like, oh, it's a 4. Like, what do you think what's that attributed to?
Well, that's actually statistically proven. So women's pain is underestimated by doctors. There's been study after study to prove this. And I have one cosmic example myself, which is, so I did not know that the risk of appendicitis in women over 35, and when you have pregnancy over 35, is 80% higher than the general public. Nobody ever told me that statistic either. So after I gave birth to my last child at age 40, he was 6 months old, and I started having intense pain in my side. And I went to my, at that time, GP, who's no longer my GP because of this story. I went to my GP, and I liked her a lot, but her partner is an asshole. And he diagnosed gas. And I was like, look, dude, I have had gas. This is not gas. And he's like, oh, please, it's fine, it's gas. If appendicitis would hurt a lot if I pressed here. And I was like, that does hurt a lot. He's like, but you're not wincing. I'm like, I've learned not to wince. And I get into the waiting room to pay for this bad appointment, and I collapse in the waiting room. And literally when I come to, he's standing over me, like one leg akimbo, like one leg on either side of me. And he looks down and he's like, come on, it can't be that bad.
Like this? Like this?
Yeah. Come on, it can't be that bad. And I was like, I need to get to the hospital. And he's like, okay, you do you, basically. And I walked out of his office. I could barely walk. I found a stranger that I could lean on to get to the corner so that I could get a taxi. The stranger got me into the taxi, and I had an emergency appendectomy an hour later. So our pain is not only underestimated, it is dismissed over and over and over again.
But do you feel that sometimes women are also trained
Yes.
to not complain?
Yeah.
And there's a auto gag of sort of admitting how much pain that you're in because
Right.
you don't feel like you're going to be believed. So
So
it's a perpetuating.
So that day, before that bleed out that I read about at the beginning of the book, I had gone to the emergency room downtown, and I said,
Because you had started bleeding, right?
I'd started bleeding. It wasn't so bad at that point, but I was in so much pain. It didn't seem right to be in that much pain. Yes, I just had a trachelectomy. I just had surgery, but at that point, it was a week later. I should have been feeling a little bit better. And they said, how's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? And so as a woman, we game it. We're like, okay, if I say 10, they're going to think I'm hysterical. Hysterical comes from the word womb. We're just doomed from the start. So you game it. And you're like, okay, if I say 7, is that enough? And so I think I said 7. And then I said, can somebody look inside me? And he's like, oh yeah, we don't have a gynecologist in the emergency room. I'm like, you don't have a gynecologist in the emergency room? Like, you don't have a speculum. Somebody can't look inside me with a speculum right now. And they're like, no, that's best done with your doctor on a weekday. I'm like, really?
But it doesn't even make sense because don't they have to deliver babies sometimes in the emergency room?
Not in the emergency room. No, I don't know.
I guess it's like they only have labor and delivery wards.
And I guess they didn't even know, they didn't have somebody that could look inside me and say whether, literally, had they looked inside me, they would have seen vaginal cuff dehiscence is a fraying of the stitches at the top of the vaginal canal, and it comes undone. Had they looked, they would have seen that it was fraying and about to burst.
Right. Well, you were very inconveniently having your emergency not during normal business
not during
hours.
the time that the gynecologist
Right.
was there. Yeah.
All right. Hey, how are we doing, by the way? We're on time. Are we?
I have a watch.
What time is it?
It's 7:45.
It's been 5 minutes. It sort of feels.
Yeah.
You say it's 7:45?
It's 7:45.
That's so crazy. All right, I'm going to shift gears a little bit.
Sure.
I want to just do a little bit of craft questions. One thing that I have noticed, I know we're talking about memory and things blurring together. I sometimes think about how, dates and events and names sort of, get lost in the morass of sands of time and brain. But when something happens to your body, it's indelible and it's put in there in that muscle memory. And I think about like the birth of my 2 children or my neck tumor, like those are these things that I've been through, that my body's been through, that I always remember the date. And you remember the season and it's sort of seared in memory. I wondered when you were writing this book, and so much of it is about traumatic things that have happened to your body, although some of them you're probably unconscious,
right.
But most of them leading up to it, first of all, if the sort of fear and the drama of it seared things into your memory so that they feel indelible. And then if that's the case, if they're in more stark relief, how did you go about trying to fill in the other things that you're reconstructing this decade, about a decade, right?
Right.
Were you going back to journals? I know you're a photographer, so is it like you're going through your iPhoto and trying to reconstruct? Like, how do you get those moments that are less
I was definitely
present?
going through my iPhone. I think iPhones are amazing memory prompts. Like, I think everybody should just take a photo a day just to like remember where you were that day, and not just to take the photo, just like, okay, if you ever wanted to write about it. So yeah, I was going back through my Google Calendar, my iPhone. For some of the times when I was unconscious, I had to ask my daughter, like, what happened that day. And I would ask friends. But, we were talking about this a little earlier, like every memoir is one person's perspective. So, my family, for example, I have a scene in here about my dad died of pancreatic cancer when he was 67. And it was pretty comical death scene, which you can read about. But my family was a little pissed that I had written it the way that I had written it. And I said, but it was funny. And like that actually is useful that it was funny, because my mom was being totally crazy. And it's a gift that she was so funny, because I get to remember that horrific death rattle and horrific death scene with my mom being ridiculous. And my sisters were like, yes, but you shamed our family. Like, nobody ever wants a memoirist in their family, ever. But I believe in telling the truth. And I believe I only have my truth and I only have my memory. And for me to whitewash my dad's death scene to make it a little sadder and a little bit, more poignant, when it wasn't poignant, it was funny, to me felt false. So I think we all come at memoir and we all come at writing and we all come at narrative. And even if you're telling a story to a friend, you're coming at it from your particular perspective, which will be different from the other person that was in that room that day.
Hey, you know what?
Oh, that leads you to that, right?
It does. I wanted you to read, because I love this. This is the author's note, the prologue of Deb's first memoir, Shutterbabe. And I think it speaks to this, and I want to leap off from this after you've read it to everybody. Thank you for humoring me.
Yeah.
Letting me just feed you things.
I just let you slide right into that one. So this is just an author's note that I put at the beginning of my first book, and I said, throw 10 photojournalists in front of a burning house, and I guarantee you'll get 10 different pictures of that house. One of them will snap a wide shot of the whole fiery mess. Another might focus on a single window, a singed teddy bear smoldering on its sill, while a third might get distracted by the young couple who, oblivious to the blaze, are making out under a streetlight in the far distance. This is a work of nonfiction, but this is also my story, my slideshow, my burning house. Enter it knowing that, beyond a few name changes here and there, Every flame is real.
I wondered if you could just speak for a minute about, I mean, because it's clear in your photography and in your writing, not just your memoirs, but the nonfiction pieces that you do for The Atlantic and op-eds you've done elsewhere, that you are looking for the truth and you're trying in different media to accomplish that.
And to get it out there.
And to get it out there
yeah.
and to express it. And I wondered if you could just talk for a minute about these tools in your toolbox, at your lens as a photographer, your words as a writer. How do those two things inform each other? Do you find that like your aesthetic as a photographer, where you're capturing one moment and figuring out how to frame it, do you ever think about that, like that illustrative moment when you're writing, or does writing make you feel more liberated because you're not held down and you can explain everything? Like, how do they inform each other?
So when I was a photojournalist, I always felt, so I worked for an agency called Gamma, and then I worked for an agency called Contact, and the way the agency system worked back then is there was a photographer, and the photographer would go out in the field and send the photos back with captions, and then they had writers in the office that would write up the stories. And I always thought that was insane, because I was like, well, I'm living it. I know how to write. I can write it up. But back in those days, they didn't understand that a photographer could write or a writer could photograph. And even the magazines were completely just bifurcated, and the only magazine that actually ever let me do both was Oprah magazine, because I finally convinced my editor there that we should sit down with the photo editor, all three of us, and talk about what we were going to accomplish, all three of us together. And it was the only time that I convinced a magazine that I could do both and get paid for both. I mean, might as well get paid for both, right?
Was your editor a woman at that?
Two women, yeah. Women, Oprah magazine had almost all women. But going back to your earlier question about how does photography inform writing and how does writing inform photography, in photography, it's about elimination, right? You're eliminating things that are unnecessary. You're trying to shoot what's essential. And I think it's really good practice for writers to try to shoot photographs, because you're supposed to do that in your writing too. Like, you can just write, anytime I write a first draft, it's like, bleh, it's like a throw up, right? And then your job is to clean up the throw up and to get to the essential truth of the words that you put out there. But that's also like, when you're framing a photo, you want to just like, if I was going to frame this woman here, I'm just going to get her, maybe you, but I'm not going to get everybody else, because I just want a portrait of her. But if I want like the whole scene, I would then pull back. But you have to know what you're focusing on. Like, a photograph makes you have a split-second decision as what is important here. And that's very useful for when you're writing, because you're trying to focus on what's important as well.
Okay. Because I realize that this is like speed round. We're gonna move into speed round now, because there's just so many things I want to talk about. Here's an issue or a topic, and I'm gonna let you take it any way you want. But as a conflict-averse person who just like runs and hides away from any argument, one of the things that I was so amazed by in both of your books is that, not just like literally you're running into and seeking out war as much as possible. You were hungry for that battle, for that conflict, and you were sort of going to Afghanistan, looking around like, give me some battle. But this is the way you've lived your life as well, professionally, where you have not taken the path of least resistance. You have very frequently, willingly thrown yourself into situations, whether it's through an op-ed or whether it's the letter that you published to the man who date raped you in college, where you have chosen to do the courageous thing. And I want you to talk about one of those times, and then I want you to tell me, are there any moments, first of all, when you've done that you feel like you're doing it for more than just yourself? Are you doing it for other women who are behind you who could benefit from your using your voice?
So the anecdote that comes to mind specifically is I was asked to work for a magazine called The Observer our newspaper called The Observer by its editor, Ken Kurson, who, the minute I said yes to the offer, took it away. He sexually harassed me. He kept trying to, it's a longer story, but there was sexual harassment, and at one point he writes to me, how come you never asked me out? And dangling this job, and sexual harassment's really about power, it's not about sex. And so I was inspired by the Me Too movement. I mean, the sexual harassment occurred before #MeToo, or before it became a big thing. And I tried to get the Observer to pay attention to me. I wrote them and I said, I've been sexually harassed by the boss, and nobody returned my call, and nobody, and the one woman that I did reach out to said, I don't think this is any of my business. So I gave up.
And that was HR, right?
No, she wasn't HR, she was an editor.
You reached out to HR.
I tried to reach out to HR, but nobody called me back. And because I was a freelancer, it didn't matter because I was not under protection of the HR. So I had no recourse. So then I realized after Me Too that I did have a recourse, which is my voice, and that has been my recourse all along. And so I wrote How to Lose Your Job from Sexual Harassment in 33 Easy Steps, and I published that in The Atlantic. And again, humor is always useful because tongue-in-cheek gets the point across that people actually read it. And so Ken Kurson, this boss of mine, I wasn't going to name him. That was cowardly of me. But I just was like,
Well, do we want to remind people who he is for those who maybe don't?
Well, then, that comes out in the rest of this, which is that when I published this about Ken Kurson, I received letter after letter after letter after letter of women and two men telling me that Ken Kurson had done horrible things to them as well. Usually I get some letters when I write stories like, oh, this spoke to me, or,
Oops.
Oopsie. But this was the first time that I'd written a story where the perpetrator in my story was the perpetrator in their story over and over and over again. One of the stories was so crazy that it was criminal. And then Ken Kurson got nominated to the Trump White House as arts something or other. I forget what it was.
But he was a crony of Kushner's.
He was Jared Kushner. Well, Kushner owned The Observer. And so Trump suddenly gets nominated, Ken Kurson, my sexual harasser, gets nominated to the Trump White House. And of course, as part of that, the FBI has to do a vetting. And as a joke, on Twitter, I wrote, hey, FBI, call me, I know things. But I didn't even at them. I was literally just putting a joke out there. And lo and behold, the FBI showed up at my door. And they were there for 4 hours. And I showed them, I had so many allegations of sexual harassment and other crimes, many crimes, that I made a Google Doc, because to organize them, because I was
people were reaching out to you.
People were reaching out to me after the story in The Atlantic, lots and lots and lots of people. They were calling me, they wanted to have coffee with me. I was suddenly the repository of all the terrible Ken Kurson stories. And then Ken Kurson, because of some of the stuff that I told the FBI, got arrested for cyber stalking. But then on the morning of Biden's inauguration, at 4 a.m., my partner wakes me up and he's like, guess what? I'm like, what? And he goes, Trump pardoned Kurson. And I was like, oh shit, because I was the informant, and what does that mean for me? And oh my God, what? He was pardoned? And so I freaked out. I got on the phone with Robbie Kaplan of the Me Too Foundation, I forget what it's called. Anyway, I was like on the phone with detectives. I found a private investigator. Like I have this private investigator on speed dial now because I was just like, oh my God, he's gonna send his henchmen after me. And then suddenly, like a few weeks ago, Ken Kurson got arrested again.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, because I don't, like my brain, this is now estrogen related, like my brain's not working, I can't remember the exact details, but yeah, he was arrested on a different.
It feels like a happy ending though. To this,
yeah,
to this
yeah.
Can you think of a time when you did not speak up that you regret or are haunted by, or you feel like you've pretty much found a way to do that?
Well, I mean, I was date raped on the night before my graduation, and I went to the University Health Services the next morning, and I said, I was raped. What do I do? And at the time, they didn't really have a way to help you. They just said, well, you can report this to the police, or you can leave college and go live your life. And I said, well, what happens if I report it to police? They're like, well, you probably have to stick around Cambridge for another year or so while the case goes through the court, and yeah, you won't get to start your life. And I was like, well, I really want to start my life. And he's already raped me once, so I don't want him to rape me again. And I didn't report him to the police because I didn't want to deal with it. I just didn't want to deal with it. I regretted that. I mean, I don't really regret it because I got to start my life, but I also regretted that I didn't say anything, which is what led me during the Kavanaugh hearings to reach out to my rapist and say, hey, dude, by the way, you raped me, and I've been carrying this around for 30 years. And
did you start that process by sending him the letter?
I sent a letter. I sent an email. I sent him an email, and I got
tell everyone what happened, because it's a pretty
So
story.
after I sent this letter, not expecting him to respond at all, you know, I wasn't expecting anything other than I needed to unburden myself of this truth. 30 years after the day that it happened, as Kavanaugh is getting elected to the Supreme Court and taking away our right to abortion. And my rapist reached out to me 20 minutes later. I sent the email at like, whatever, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By 3:20, I had a phone call from my rapist. And he was unbelievably kind. And he said, oh my God, I am so sorry. I've gone through he was a drunk, and he had actually passed out in the bed after he raped me, and I couldn't get him to move. And in fact, when he woke up, he was like, hey, give me a call sometime, and like walked out the door. And I could tell even then that he had no idea what had happened. And so he said, look, I had blackouts, and that's no excuse, but I don't remember a thing. If you said it happened, I'm sure it happened because I was a horrible drunk. I have made amends to everyone that I thought I had harmed, but clearly I did not know I harmed you, or I would have made amends, so let me do that right now. And we had an incredible conversation that lasted about 40 minutes, and this burden that I'd been carrying around for 30 years was gone. You know, that didn't happen to other friends of mine who tried to do it after me, but it's nice that it happened to me.
I think we have time for just one more, and then is that right? All right, I was wondering, one of my favorite moments in your story is when things were, you were in a pretty dark place. That's not my favorite part.
Yeah.
When you're in a dark place, you were even having some suicidal ideation. You were looking out your fourth floor window and wondering what that would feel like.
Yeah.
And instead, you turned to improv comedy. Yeah. Now, improv comedy is something that my husband Sean and I used to love doing. I hear some improv fans in the audience as well. And the tenet of improv is always the yes and. You never negate on stage, right? Because it kills the scene. But yes and, the theory that this is where comedy comes from. It doesn't matter how absurd something is, you just go with it and it keeps moving forward. Can you just tell us about what happened when you let the concept of yes and, where did you start and where did you finish? And then how is yes and sort of helping you or informing you now?
So I don't know what the impulse was to join an improv comedy class while my marriage fell apart and I was suicidal, but it came. It came up, it just came up, and there's a $40 introductory class, and I joined the class, and I really feel like it's life-changing. Like, I think everyone should do improv, everybody, because, like, the concept of yes and is like, if Desi says to me, look, here's my pet squirrel, I'm not allowed to say, that's not a squirrel, or so what? I have to say, yes, and I'm going to saute him. So, like, you have to keep building, yes, and if you take it on as sort of as a way of living, I mean, at first I really went whole hog. So, for example, I was sitting in my apartment, somebody knocked on the door, and they're like, oh, we're shooting a film across the street next week, can we use your apartment as holding for the extras? I was like, yes, and I can cook them dinner. And then, like, and then, like, my friend Marion called me from Paris. I lived in Paris for 4 years, so my friend Marion calls me, and she's like, listen, my niece is coming to New York with 3 of her friends before they head, or 2 of her friends before they head to medical school. Can they stay with you? And I was like, yes, and I can get them parts as extras in the film. And I did. Like, all this happened. And then, like, there's one moment where my daughter was, like, doing her homework in our living room, and it was, like, 35 extras, a dinner that I had cooked, the 3 French exchange students, and my friend Soman Chainani, who's a children's book author, walks in the door, because he, like, would hang out with us, and he, like, walks in and he's like, looks at Sasha and he's like, what's going on? She's like, Mom's saying yes and to everything, whatever.
So right now, here you are, you're in Portland, Maine, you said yes and to coming up and seeing us, but are you still, does that still reside somewhere in the back of your brain, the yes and sort of philosophy of always adding on?
100%. I think that, I mean, I've gone through trauma. Everybody goes through trauma in life, right? The traumas that are chronicled in this book really were like one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other. It was just like, I felt a little bit like Job. And
well, especially like rule of 3 in comedy, you're like, did you tell your body, okay, we did get to 3
done.
and now we're at 6,
we're done.
Like we're okay,
yeah,
we're
done.
Here?
We're done. And I think that without yes and, without just like standing back up again and keep going, like, you know, you can choose, you can choose death or you can choose keep going. And like, I'm always gonna just keep going because there's no other option, right?
I think that's a
good place to stop.
I want to thank everybody for coming and listening. Thank you to Deborah.
Thanks, Debbie.
I am sure that there are books over here. Print Kindly is selling copies of Ladyparts. I'm sure that Deborah would be willing to sign.
Yeah, I have a Sharpie with travel. I'll go sit over there with the girls and we can sign them together. Yeah.
Okay, and I wish that we had time to like take questions, but maybe we can hang out a little bit here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Bunker for hosting us here. Thank you, Portland Public Library. Thank you, press.